Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new edition of True Crime with the Sarge. I'm your host, Joseph Jackalone, and with us tonight we have Anthony DeStefano, who is a Pulitzer Prize and Emmy Award-winning journalist. We're going to talk about basically organized crime tonight, but from his book, Broadway Butterfly, Vivian Gordon, the Lady Gangster of Jazz Age New York. Tony, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's quite an honor, and I'm glad we can do this.
Yeah, no, this is fantastic. I'm always interested in organized crime. A lot of people are also organized crime fans or aficionados. So this one actually kind of plays into something different because unlike a lot of the other gangsters that are in this book, I never heard of Vivian Gordon. How did you end up stumbling upon this?
Well, that's interesting because I was doing research on prohibition, right? The post 1918, 1919 bar on sale, manufacture of alcohol, and I came across the murder late, probably around 1930, 31. I was looking for stuff, and I said that's an odd case, and I looked at it, and I thought it was a one-off thing. But it didn't turn out to be that way. What happened was that was a sensational murder of Vivian Gordon, who was a witness in a long-standing corruption and government investigation. Um, and it took off. I mean, it just, every day I was going through the old newspapers, and I would see the stories replicated all over the place. The Times, the Daily News, papers in London, Canada, all over the country. It was a big murder because she was a witness, and she supposedly held the key to some corruption in New York City, uh, which in that period of time was pretty rife. There was a lot going on. The
Oh yeah, well, yeah,
government, the whole works.
yeah, we're going to talk about Tammany Hall, the police corruption, and all the different things, including what a lot of people don't know is the governor of New York State at the time was boom.
The mayor, you're talking Jimmy
No,
Walker.
well, yeah, but the governor of New York State was whom?
Oh, the governor. I can tell you it was Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Right. So a lot of people don't realize, right? The former president Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the governor of New York State way back when, and he was presiding all of this. So we're going to get into all of that.
Right.
The link to the book, folks, is going to be given every 5 minutes out by our favorite Nightbot. So just make sure you pick up a copy of that. This is a fascinating read. I have my own copy now for quite a number of months because I ran into Tony at the Hamptons who done it back in April. So I've had this copy of the book for a while. So if you're really interested in the old organized crime stories, this is the book to read. So let's start off. We're in one of my old stopping grounds in the Bronx, Van Cortlandt Park. So tell us what happens on that morning. I think it was it February in
It
1931?
was February 26th, 1931, and a worker going to his trucking job a short distance away in Yonkers was taking a cut through the park, Van Cortlandt Park, which at that point was a golf course, green space in the Bronx. You know it well. And he noticed on the side of the road a body of a woman. It was disheveled. Her clothes were in disarray, and her limbs were sort of, contorted, and her head was, sort of tilted. And he got help. He got the police, and they came, and they took the body, of course, and took it away. And they didn't know who it was because she had no ID. So they ran the fingerprints, and lo and behold, it turned out she had an arrest for a prostitution charge some years earlier, which she can always contested. Anyway, it turned out Vivian Gordon was the name of the dead woman. And it so happened that days before she was murdered and found in the park, that she had been talking with investigators who were looking into, among other things, police corruption in New York City, and tangentially the administration of Mayor Jimmy Walker, and a series of other things, the court system, corrupt judges, corrupt bailiffs, corrupt bondsmen, and stuff of the sort. So she was giving them information, and a few days later, she was supposed to show up again, and she never did because she was dead in the Bronx. In that case, because of the corruption investigation link, because of all of the characters involved, because it was involving City Hall, the cops. It spread like wild. It was a story that spread like wildfire, and it just took off. And I hadn't heard about it like you, and I started digging into it, and it turned out to be a really big story, and it really led to a lot of collateral investigations that ultimately would do poorly for Mayor Walker. And it was just a tremendous story, tremendous case, which nobody had heard about in our time.
No, I remember when we first talked about this way back when, and we were throwing this back and forth. I had never heard about it. I mean, I heard about all the other characters that are involved in this, but
Yeah.
I never heard about this. But so this is actually an interesting little thing because we have her real name was Benita Bischoff, right?
Yeah, Benita Bischoff. She was married. The marriage didn't last all that long, but she had a child with a gentleman, her husband, and so she had that was her official name at death. And she originally was Benita Franklin, and she was born in Indiana. So, Franklin to Bischoff to Vivian Gordon. Vivian Gordon was her stage name. Why is that? Because she had aspirations to be on Broadway. A lot of women in that period, we're talking now in the just pre-Depression, roaring 20s era, wanted to make it big on Broadway. Look, not everybody's going to make it big on Broadway. We know that, right? And for every one role, there's probably 100 to 1,000 women who wanted to partake. So she got some minor roles, though. I mean, she wasn't a total flop. She got some roles in the one of the production companies and got into some productions, and she actually did get some stage presence. But that's not enough. So she had to do something else to support herself and her child, who was also named Benita, by the way. And she took up for time with Polly Adler. Now, some people may remember the name Polly Adler as the premier madam of New York in the Jazz Age and in the Prohibition era. And for that, Polly was a madam, and she ran a series of bordellos. Vivian worked with her. She had a relationship for a time being, and then she struck out on her own. And Vivian's twist on the story was that she would run a sexual extortion racket where her friends, her women friends, would get into the good graces of gentlemen who were well-heeled and had a lot of money, usually were married, and they would get into compromising situations. And of course, the pitch was, well, we'll keep this quiet, but, we need something. We need money. We need jewelry. We need favors and stuff like that. So they would squeeze these men. And for Vivian, it turned out to be quite lucrative. And she had her own little competitive racket with Polly Adler and some of the other madams around town. So it was a twist on the old rackets that you had in the 19th century, where people would sexually extort gentlemen who didn't want their activities known to their spouses or families. So this has actually worked. It worked for a while anyway.
Right, yeah. I mean, we still see this scheme running today, right? So you compromise some of these guys who are in the position, right? And then boom, you kind of own them at that point. But she had some serious clients, I guess we want to talk about, including so she's found dead, right? So she's strangled. They find her fingerprints, and then they find out exactly who she is. So they do a search at the apartment, and what's the big find that they get over there?
Well, they had a number of big finds, but the biggest one was a diary, a set of volumes of books with the names of clients and her women, of course, her staff or workers, whatever you want to call them. And that was getting everybody, excited because there were a lot of names in that book. We didn't know all of them. We got some of them, and some of them are in the book. But there were supposedly like 300 names. So everybody was really worried about that. It was like, I suppose maybe like the Epstein file today. People were worried about what's in the so-called Epstein file. Well, Vivian had these diaries, these books, and it had a lot of names in them. And so she was, everybody was worried that somebody was going to be exposed. And that was one idea about the motive for her death, although, it didn't seem to hold up. But the diaries were the big thing. And very nice furnished apartment. So she was doing very well at that racket. Look, she wasn't the multimillionaire, but she had a nice life, a nice apartment, She had some real estate, and she had fur coats and jewelry and stuff like that. So she was doing okay.
Right, so this is what really catches FDR's attention, right? Because he's got this scandal brewing in New York City. He's got uh, grandeur ideas, right, to become president one day, and he doesn't want this derailing him. So he kind of gets himself involved with the Tammany Hall and the Jimmy Walkers and stuff like that. And
Well,
that, and
here's
that's
what,
how.
yeah, that's right. I mean, look, Roosevelt knew he needed the Democratic Party in New York City to help his presidential ambitions. So he had to tread very carefully with this investigation. Now, he had Seabury, Judge Seabury, was the guy, the point man on the investigation, sort of straight arrow, a guy who came from a long line of clergy. And he was running the investigation. So he would talk with Roosevelt and let him know what was going on. Didn't give him the whole 9 yards. And, Roosevelt wanted to be kept abreast. And he realized, of course, that he couldn't interfere with the investigation because that would look like he was condoning murder, corruption, and all the chicanery of Tammany Hall. On the other hand, he couldn't go too far because, he had to play this delicate balance because he needed the Democrats in New York to back his candidacy for presidency. So he had this sort of tightrope that he had to walk, and it was interesting the way this impacted Roosevelt, and ultimately down the road he had to take a more direct role in what was unfolding, particularly with Mayor Walker.
Right. Just wanted to take a quick shout out to One Love for that super sticker. Thank you very much, One Love. So we have like when you think about all of the names that are involved in this, I mean, these are the names that we find in the history books, right? Former president of the United States and the gangsters, right? You mentioned Lucky Luciano in here and Dutch Schultz, Arthur Flegenheimer. But one of the other people that always catch my attention was Legs Diamond because he seemed to
Right.
be, yeah, I think they refer to him as the clay pigeon of the underworld, right? Because he kept on
That's
getting
right.
shot.
He
He
was
kept
shot
on getting
many
shot.
times.
Yeah, he refused to die.
He had 7 lives, 9 lives, whatever you want to call it. But he was wounded many times in many ambushes until he finally, of course, got his comeuppance in Albany. But Legs Diamond worked with Vivian. They had a working relationship up to a point. And I think he was sort of the heavy in it. He didn't want to pay her all of what she thought was due, and that fractured their relationship. And there was him, Legs Diamond, premier gangster of the time, well-known guy. There was Vonnie Williams, who was Higgins, rather, who was the premier Irish bootlegger gangster in Brooklyn, killer, and he was close with Vivian. Judge Crater, right, the mythical Judge Crater, who to this day nobody has found, and he was a participant in Vivian's salons. He knew her girls, and he was able to go to her apartment and to socialize with the women.
Good way of putting it.
And then Arnold Rothstein was a figure who's peripherally involved with Vivian. It was never locked down as exactly what the relationship was, but these are some heavy characters of the period. And of course, if you're going to do business in New York during Prohibition, in the Jazz Age, on Broadway, you're going to know these characters. You're going to cross paths with them, and you may do business with them. Well, at least they're going to know who they are. And there are other people too. Luciano was sort of, in his way, getting into his own element. I'm not sure that he knew Vivian. He may have known who she was, and vice versa. But a lot of characters in the story floating around.
Right. And the other one that caught my attention was Arnold Rothstein.
Rothstein, of course. Rothstein, the premier fixer in many ways, in sports, in labor relations, believe it or not. He was kind of like the unofficial arbitrator of disputes, and he was a gambler. And he was very good at some of his gambling. But then again, his luck ran out, and he apparently got killed over a debt that he was owed another gambler. But he was a big name. Rothstein, you got Legs Diamond, you got Higgins, You probably the Dutch Schultz is in there someplace,
Yep.
and you got a bunch of other characters too. Some peripheral people.
And I think there was the other one that I know well, Vincent Mad Dog Cole.
Oh, Vincent Cole, yeah, he was. He would figure later in the attempts to take part in the Mafia hits, go after the bosses. He was supposed to, I think, kill Luciano, but Luciano got a heads up on that,
Yep.
and it was Luciano who actually killed Maranzano, or had people kill Maranzano, which destabilized the old mafia structure at the time, bringing in Luciano's new mafia structure, the commission, and the attendant uh, line of succession that followed up until today.
And if you're interested in more mob stories, Tony's written a number of books, including Gotti Boys, and he's written a number of these books. So he is an organized crime historian for sure. I've talked to him a couple of times before. I'm doing my classes on organized crime, so it's actually kind of interesting. So when you're looking at his book on Broadway Butterfly, you could also check out some of his other books if you're interested in this topic. So the bright lights in the big city, attracts a lot of people that we know. But does it seem to you through your research that maybe Vivian was doing this, like keeping this list as basically a kind of either a get out of jail free card or just kind of a, just a kind of a scheme kind of thing?
Well, I think it was two things. I think yes, I think it was kind of a get out of jail free card, but I also think she wanted some sort of record because she knew that something might happen to her, and she had premonitions that even our closest people, closest friends, were going to try to do her in. So she would write this stuff in her diary, and she would put the finger on certain people as a way, I think, of it's sort of a strange last will and testament for the police if anything ever happened to her. And of course, it did happen to her, and that did implicate some of these names, and they did get some heat, although they weren't necessarily charged, but they did get heat.
Yeah, but when you think about it, by her doing this and all, she helps clean up New York City, right? I mean, there's a big kind of push to
There
push the.
is, yeah. I mean, look, her death, uh, as insignificant as it may have seemed at the time, suddenly exploded. And the newspapers, the progressive element in the city, started to say, look, we can't have this. We can't have witnesses being killed. The gangsters are running the town. Mayor Walker, you have to do something about this. And they were putting heat on Walker. And Walker, of course, well, he tried to do something. He had the cops investigate. What are you going to do? You have the cops investigate. But that didn't stop the crescendo of voices, of liberal voices and reformist voices. They blamed Walker, Tammany Hall, gangsters, all in the same pot. So this was something that cascaded after Vivian's death. And what added to that was the fact that her daughter, Vivian's daughter, 16 years old, was so distraught over her mother's death and what the papers were saying about it that she killed herself. She killed herself. She was in New Jersey. She was going to school, high school. She turned on the gas, sealed the room, and they found her dead. So big funeral, by the way. As opposed to Vivian, you had virtually nobody at her funeral except her grief-stricken brother, the undertaker, and a nurse, and the pallbearers, of course.
Yeah, I guess a lot of the people that she was.
Oh, they stayed away. It was
Yeah,
like, forget it.
because they knew the cameramen and the newspapers would be there.
And they
If
were.
you think, yeah. So I mean, but we see that all the time with some of the old mob wakes and funerals where the FBI is outside and the thing. But this was way before even the FBI was going on. I mean,
Yeah,
when you're
that's
dealing
true.
with, yeah, when you're dealing with people don't realize it, but the 18th Amendment of the Volstead Act and banning the sale and manufacturing of alcoholic beverages kind of like set this organized crime stuff in motion.
It did. Nick Pileggi, who I talk with a lot and has written, many, many books, uh, has said that it was like the high octane for the mob. Prohibition made guys who were, head breakers and street toughs millionaires because they filled the need. They filled the smuggling rackets. They did the transportation. They bribed the cops, and they became very, very wealthy in the process. And that set the stage for later activity down the road. Look, Frank Costello, businessman, uh, he pioneered the smuggling route from Canada of liquor from the Canadian French provinces to New York and the East Coast. And he became very wealthy from that. And that fueled his gambling machine operations in New York City, which ultimately he ran into trouble with May LaGuardia, but that's another story. But this is the way it worked. I mean, these guys, from basically local gangsters, became the big names of organized crime, names we talk about even today.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of money to be made on these things for sure. And like I said, I always remember from the Godfather movie, the famous, we're bigger than U.S. Steel, right? I mean, that was just a fiction part of it, but they really were.
Well, they made a lot of money. About today's standards, the money they were making uh, may not seem a lot, but you had guys who had bank accounts with millions and millions of dollars in them, and for back then, that was a lot of money. And they were able to buy politicians, easily buy the police, buy whatever they needed, and sort of get a good control of the city at that point. And that was important. And prohibition became, in some sense, although prohibition was started as an idea of uh, tamping down lawlessness and bad habits and whatnot, became actually fuel for the fire.
When you are researching one of your books like this, when you were looking at the Vivian Gordon thing, was there any like an aha moment or like a holy cow moment when you were looking at some of these things or trying to find them?
Well, I mean, what happened was, the problem is that everybody's basically dead when you're writing these kinds of stories. So there's nobody really alive uh, to interview or talk with. So you had to go back into old newspaper files, which are tremendous, by the way, back in that
Hmm.
era. And you had to go into um, old court records that you can find and sort of stitch the story together. I mean, the aha moment was, of course, I think, uh, when we found out that she was, uh, you know, running this extortion scheme, and that was, of course, big. And also the tie-in with Judge Crater, because all of these strange, you know, noir kind of storylines sort of intersected with her life, and that was really the kind of revelation that I didn't expect in doing this.
Right. I mean, when you think about when you're reading your book here, if you know New York City history, all these names start popping up, and like I said, the intersection between all these things. Just quickly, for those that may not know who Judge Crater was, what's his? I guess, like pull a crater, right?
Yeah, yeah. Judge Crater was a judge. I think it was Joseph Force Crater was his name, who he was Supreme Court judge, and there were suggestions that he was corrupt. Uh, but he had a good nightlife. He was married, but he had girls and girlfriends and stuff. And he went out one night to have dinner in Manhattan, and was last seen getting into a taxi cab, and was never seen again. Now, um, there were all sorts of theories about what happened, and all sorts of sightings. In fact, it became a joke about where the latest sighting of Judge Crater was in late night TV shows, talk shows. But one of the things I did discover in this, and I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but a guy who ultimately was suspected of killing Vivian did get convicted of a different crime and was sent to the electric chair. And supposedly, this is the way the story works, he spilled his beans to a cellmate who wasn't being executed, but told him what happened to Crater. The Crater welched on a deal, a payoff deal, and was taken to New Jersey and killed, and his body dumped in the river someplace. That story circulated probably around 1956, somewhere in there. It's in the book. Uh, any proof? Everybody's gone, right?
Right.
The guy's gone. The guy was executed. The writer of the story, uh, who was the interviewer, he's gone. Whatever happened, I don't know. But clearly, Crater was something happened to Crater and it wasn't good.
Yeah, they had us in Coney Island looking under the
That's right. Under the
yeah
boardwalk, bound by the aquarium.
yeah
That's
where I think it was the sister or whatever had found a letter, or the
right.
granddaughter found a letter, and next
Right.
thing you know they were calling cold case, and we were looking into this thing, and I that was like the first time I ever heard of Judge Crater's name in
Yeah,
that whole
we
thing,
did
and I
stories about that. We did stories about that
yeah
uh, at that time. The cold case revival was very interesting. Probably in the early 2000s, maybe late 90s, 1990s. I don't remember, but I remember doing the story, and it was like the case revived, and it was like, oh, we're going to find Judge Crater. Nobody found anything.
yeah nobody found, yeah, including us, we didn't find him. But you know, it's actually it's pretty interesting though when you get into the history of this stuff, and these people's names keep on popping up in different stories.
Right?
That's the thing.
Yeah, exactly.
All the characters that you were dealing with, and I call them characters because they're, like I said, they're historical figures that we talk about a lot. You know, Crater, Arnold Rothstein, we know with the Black Sox scandal and everything like that. What who do you think is like the most interesting out of that group? You know, in that kind of with this whole thing with Vivian.
Well, I really think that I'm fascinated by Legs Diamond. He was the most interesting, not only because he cheated death so many times, but because uh, he was a character who was into so many things and kind of uh, was just interesting. It was just an interesting guy.
Yeah.
Uh, he is buried after he was murdered. He was buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery.
Well, yep. Queens,
And
unmarked grave, right?
unmarked grave, and I can't figure. I've tried to get the location, and they said no, we can't give that. And I said, well,
Yeah.
why? It's like 60 years later, 70 years later. Why not? And for some reason they won't. But ultimately, I'm going to try to find out where he's buried. Uh, they had him in one spot, and then they dug him up and put him in another spot to thwart the curious. He's
Yeah.
interesting. Um, one of the guys who was accused of killing Vivian but never convicted, Harry Stein, was interesting because of what he said about Judge Crater. And I find that fascinating. I don't know how we can ever verify that, what he said, but that is very interesting. That's intriguing to me. Those are two interesting characters out of all this. Of course, Vivian herself was interesting.
Of
And
course, yeah.
um, she was, uh, you know, the term butterfly, when we talk about Broadway Butterfly, is emblematic of all the women who came to Broadway to seek careers. And the story was, they like butterflies, they were circulating around the lights of Broadway because they were attracted to the lights, the fame, the glamour, the money. And they got too close, some of them, and they died. And that's what happened to Vivian. And some others too, by the way.
Right. So the name of the guy you were talking about before was in prison. You say his name was Harry
Harry
Stein.
Stein, yeah.
Okay, and that's the one that you're trying to. Yeah, I guess you're going to be working on that one next.
Well, I mean, I would like to maybe get his prison records and see what's in there to confirm some of the uh, relationships he had in prison, and maybe there's something in there about Judge Crater. I don't know.
It's
That
pretty
was his
interesting.
deathbed confession, so to speak.
It's pretty interesting because it is a part of New York City history. Like I said, if you go on Google and you type in Judge Crater, I mean, the amount of articles and things that have been written on the guy,
Oh, it's tons. It's tons.
it's
It's like,
amazing.
any other famous missing person, like D.B. Cooper, the guy who
Yeah.
jumped out of the airplane. It's kind of like on that part.
Yeah. But because he was a New York State Supreme Court justice, makes it even more interesting in that
Yeah,
respect, and the mob and everything else that goes along with it.
yeah. The supposition, of course, that he was, taking money and didn't do the right thing in the case. That was the story that was passed along by this guy Stein, and the story made it into the papers back in 56, 57. in the Sunday supplements, and but it didn't go anywhere. I checked, and it really didn't go any further than that.
So what happened to Mayor Jimmy Walker now in Tammany Hall? What happens to all that stuff?
Jimmy Walker, as far as I know, didn't know Vivian. Did they cross paths in the nightlife? Maybe. Jimmy was a nightlife guy. He liked women. He was married, but he liked women. He liked booze. He used to go to speakeasy. He used to go to gambling parlors. There was a casino in Central Park, which he frequented. And he was going fast and loose, Jimmy. He didn't work very hard. He worked some, but not very hard. He was a night guy. He was a night owl. He was kind of like maybe Eric Adams was in his early days as mayor. He liked the nightlife, liked the clubs. But Jimmy, everything was happening around Jimmy in the city. Gangsters, murders. There were a lot of murders, just as Vivian, with a lot of gunplay. There's an aura of lawlessness. So they investigated Jimmy, his administration, and they came up with evidence that Jimmy was, for want of a better expression, on the take. He was taking money from friends, some friends who did business with City Hall, and that didn't sit well. He had unexplained bank accounts of large sums of money, brokerage accounts, which you couldn't really explain. He couldn't really explain it away. And that's what Seabury focused in on in the end with his investigation. Where's all this money coming from? What'd you do with this? You knew this guy. He did business with City Hall. Why are you taking this money? Walker would say, I never took a dime as a bribe. But it didn't look good. It didn't smell good. And Roosevelt ultimately was the one, Franklin Roosevelt, was ultimately the one to going to have to decide whether he was going to keep Walker as mayor or toss him. Now, this is the same rule that we had recently, we saw with Mayor Adams, where there was some talk about whether Adams was going to be cashiered out by Hochul. Roosevelt had a hearing, his own investigation. It was testimony, took testimony from Walker and other people, and it didn't look good, right? It didn't look good for Walker. And Roosevelt was saying, basically, Roosevelt's position was, if you can't explain to me where you get the money as a government official, you have a problem. And that seemed to set the stage. And people were telling Walker, Jimmy, you're through. You might as well, bow out. And he put up a brave front to the end. But then in the end, early September 1932, Walker said, that's it, I'm out. And he resigned. But he insisted he did nothing wrong. But still, he was out. So he went to Europe with his girlfriend and stayed in Europe, France, I think Italy for a while. And that's the way it went. And then he came back and, got jobs in, I think, the music industry. And then ultimately, he passed away in 46. So he died at a very young age, actually.
Was that the end of Tammany Hall then, or did that continue?
Tammany Hall was on a long slide since about 1930, 31. It was a long sloping slide. You had exposed relationships with gangsters, the cops, judges, and it was really downhill for Tammany Hall from that time on. And when Costello had his own issue with Tammany Hall, and that created, put Tammany Hall in disfavor. It really was, that was the beginning of the end for Tammany Hall.
Flynn Brown says what I think a lot of us say, dang, I wish unexplained bank accounts was my problem.
Well, he could explain them, but the explanations weren't very good.
So Sinead's got a question. It says, what are the stats for killers being arrested back in Prohibition? A lot of them were, some of them went to the electric chair, right? I mean, we had a number, including Murder Inc. going back, but that's the 30s. Prohibition was kind of over by then, but.
Yeah, I mean, you did have, if you look at the newspapers back in that period from the 1920s to 1930, 31, you turn the pages and there were gangsters and murders all the time. They arrested people, and they convicted some of them, and they, sent them to jail. They executed them. Some of them, I think, are in the book. Some of the petty people are in the book. But a lot of the big gangsters, Luciano, they were done in for other things, not necessarily murder.
Sydney Sharp has a question. Has there ever been a case where you had a twist that would have shocked you, like when you were looking at? I guess maybe during your research, was there anything shocking?
Well, shocking. I think what was surprising to me was the find about the claim about Judge Crater's demise. I hadn't heard of that before, and so that was surprising. I think the interesting thing was the way good lawyering got the suspects off in Vivian's murder case. That was in the Bronx. They did it pretty quick. They thought that had a locked case. They thought that had a great case. Very good defense attorney. Poked holes in the story and showed the chief witness, raised questions about him. I was surprised they didn't get a conviction with that. I would have thought they would have, but they didn't.
I'm sure a lot of people thought back then, and I think you kind of get that in the thing that they thought the police might have been involved, and that's because she was supposed to testify 5 days before the killing.
Yeah, there was an element of that because when she was arrested back in 1923 on prostitution charges, which she said were trumped up, there was a particular police officer who was very aggressive, detective, whose name became infamous for being hard ass with women. That was the other part of this Prohibition era. The cops would shake down women, some innocent, very many innocent, and slap them with prostitution or soliciting charges, which was easy to do, and squeeze them for money, squeeze them for money to get out of jail. You pay this, you pay the bailiff, blah, blah, you'll get out. Because women, like some of the men, didn't want to be tarred with an arrest. But Vivian didn't have that luxury. And she was convicted of a prostitution solicitation charge and sent away 3 years. And that always rankled her. That she thought that cop, she thought was a bent cop, and he screwed me because he wanted to get my daughter taken away. She got a little paranoid at that point. So that's what happened with her. And so that's why there was suspicion that maybe the police were involved. But it turned out there really wasn't anything to connect it. The cops weren't involved in the murder.
So Flora is looking forward to listening to your book on Audible. So it is, yes, it's definitely available.
It's on Audible. Yeah, it's
definitely it's on Audible. Who does the narration? Do you do the narration?
I don't do it. No, I don't do it. I think they had I think there was a woman who did the narration, as I recall. But anyway, it's a good narration. And it's out there in narration, it's out there in Kindle and audiobooks and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoy listening to some audiobooks. I still like to hold the book though. I'm
sure,
old school. I still like to hold the newspaper. I still can't do that stuff yet. So tell us a little bit about your research. Like, do you use? You have to go through microfiche? Do you go through like newspapers.com? How do you do all that old research?
Well, thank God for newspapers.com today. When I was starting out in this business years ago, you used to have to go to not only microfiche, but you had to go to the old newspaper archives in Manhattan, where they had the bound volumes. And the paper was very, brittle and sensitive. You had to carefully turn the pages. And then if you wanted a copy, you had to go to a photostat machine where they would do it for a photostat. And that takes time. It was laborious. Today, newspapers.com and other kinds of archives allow you to call up stuff very easily and very comprehensively. And you can do it that way. And I found that to be a very useful tool. The other thing, of course, is that I think you do computer searches, which will take you to other potential sources of information, other books of the time, books of the period. Then you have to go to government records. I had to go to the New York City archives to get copies of photos related to Vivian's case. That took a little bit of work, but they gave them to me. You pay them. That's like a reproduction fee, and those are very useful, and they're in the book. Autopsy photos, some not gory, but her death photo. Let's put it that way, and a lot of other photos. So I had to do that, and of course, you go into people like Legs Diamond, and that takes you down other avenues, and you could spend your life following those trails, but you have to, bring the story together. So that's what you have to do. You have to decide, okay, this is collateral, interesting, but I got to focus. How does this relate to Vivian and the period? Franklin Roosevelt has archives at, I think it's upstate in New Hyde. I didn't have to go there, but I was able to get some information. Like I said, the city has some stuff. Some court records exist, but interestingly, the court records on Vivian's murder trial weren't available. They should have been in the Bronx. So what I had to do was I had to go to a book written by the son of the defense attorney, a very noted defense attorney, and he recounted much of the trial. So you were able to use that as a guide, along with newspaper accounts, which are very, you interplay them. You sort of put the stuff around, to tell a story. So that's how that went. And then, of course, I had to look, through her death records, surrogates court, to get Vivian's will. There wasn't much in her estate, let's put it that way, maybe $200, I think. And, I had to, you just got to just follow the threads wherever they take you.
Right. And then you're dealing with, of course, a lot of dead ends, a lot of different things where things don't exist anymore or they're missing. Right. I mean,
of course,
forget about trying to find case files from the police department like that from that era.
Well, that's hard. Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah, that's next to impossible. And then, so let's, for the time we have left, you try to find her grave.
I did. It wasn't any secret where Vivian was buried. It was Mount Hope Cemetery in Hastings on Hudson. No secret. Okay, you go up there, and I went up there one day, and I said, "Well, I'm looking for Vivian Gordon," and they look at me like, "Who?" And they went to the records. There's nobody here on that date. I said, "Geez, well, how about Benita Franklin?" I said, "That was her maiden name." And, no, nothing like that here. I said, "Damn, she's got to be here. I know she's here." So I went to the surrogates court, and I pulled her estate file. And lo and behold, I found that she was buried under the name Benita Bischoff. Okay, that's good. So I went back to the cemetery, and I said, Benita Bischoff. And yep, we got it. This date, she was buried on this date at this plot. Okay, it showed me on the map where the plot is. I went up there, looking around. I don't see any tombstone. It's a blank, stretch of grass. I said, what the hell's the story? So ultimately, the cemetery says, no, she's in an unmarked grave at this particular spot. They gave me the spot. And I went up there. And I looked at the spot, and I said, okay, she's here. But, I think she deserves something to mark that she was here. She was a murder victim. She was something of a character in New York City history. So maybe I should sort of put a stone, a little marker. So to make a long story short, working with the cemetery, I had to see if any relatives were alive. There were none. And I paid for the marker, and they put the marker in probably in, I think, February, just before 2025, just before the snows. And they placed a nice marker, it's a 2 foot by 1 foot with her name, date, etc. And there it is. So I did WABC TV did a little story segment on that, about a 4-minute clip. And it really tells the story. and how I got to the gravesite, and had me at the gravesite. It's a very nice piece. So I had to find it that way. I figured, look, this is the right thing to do. She's here with nothing to mark her existence. I said, let's put a marker down.
Yeah, no, I had read about that, and I wanted to make sure that the audience knew that you did that because I thought that was a great idea. And Sinead wants to know if I'm going to go on a road trip up there to go see it. I guess we will. We'll go on a road trip.
Yeah,
Uh,
you could do that. I mean, it's the spot now is easier to find um, because we got the grave marker. You got a stone, and actually the guy next to her, who's buried next to her, was a seaman who may have been murdered in some sort of assault, and so he's buried next to her, about the same time, by the way, of death. And it was an interesting little touch. It's an interesting cemetery. Um, it's sloping ground. It looks over, a lot of territory. So it's interesting to see. No, I'm glad I did it because I felt that was. You're right about a lot of people in this line of work. Some of them you never find because they're missing in action, will stay missing. But this is a woman who was murdered. We know where she is. And I figured, well, let's just mark the spot.
yeah, no,
So many mob murder victims are out there. I'm doing work on the Lufthansa case, and there's so many of those people who were involved who we've never heard from again. So we don't know where they are.
yeah, yeah, we can only imagine on there. So you have a couple of new projects on the horizon.
Yeah, I'm working on a book about, like I said, the Lufthansa case, about the life of Jimmy Burke, the guy who was the architect of the Lufthansa heist. He was played by Robert De Niro in the film Goodfellas.
Hmm.
Interesting story, his life. Uh, and, it just was fascinating to do that research because of the kind of life he had as a very young child, which was quite frightening in a way.
And I think he's buried in Farmingdale, right? He's buried out in
He's
Suffolk.
out at St. Charles.
Charles. Yeah, along with the Fayol family from the Amityville Horror, they're there also.
Oh, yeah. And also one of the famous gangsters, I think Hugh Mulligan, Irish gangster of years gone by, is buried there. And Jimmy Burke took the mantle of him as the premier Irish gangster of his period. So they're sort of close by. I find that interesting.
Yeah, no, I do too. So I said it's the whole organized crime thing to me is fascinating because of the way these guys. I mean, listen, we know that it's huge pop culture and it's huge thing there, but this was
It is.
actually a yeah. This was absolutely a fascinating story. For those of you that just joined us now, it's about Vivian Gordon, the Broadway Butterfly. This is Tony DeStefano. He's the author of the book. They shared the links in the comment section for the book to Amazon. You could check out some of the other organized crime books that Tony has written. So, Tony, with the last couple of minutes that we have, was there anything that you wanted to get into the book that didn't make it? Because I guess the publisher didn't have room for it, or was there anything that made the cutting room floor?
No, I think pretty much what I could verify and thought was use, I've got in the book. Um, I think if I had time, I would have wanted to explore more the Judge Crater situation, but that would have gone down another avenue, and that would have taken, months and months.
Another rabbit hole.
I'd also like to find where our Legs Diamond was buried. That may
Yeah, well, I
happen.
I got some others. Yeah, because I tried to find it too way back when. But I had a name for that whole thing, but I'll tell you that offline because they actually said there's a stone there, but it's got a different name.
Could be.
So Sheila says, "Thanks so much for talking to us, Tony."
Thank you, Sheila. A pleasure.
And then One Love said, "We will read the book for sure. Thank you."
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and you can always
enjoy it.
yeah,
Enjoy it.
and you can always ask your public libraries to order a copy of the book also. Get it in there, get it on the shelves.
Sure. I mean, look,
Uh,
it's like if you like history, you like crime, and crime history, you're going to like the book. There's a lot of characters in there. It's a good sweep of New York history, and you recognize a lot of the names.
yep. Very good. So, for those of you that stood by and watched it, if you're watching this on the replay crew, thank you very much. Also, Tony, you hang out for a second. We're going to say goodbye to everybody. Everybody, have a great night. We'll see you soon, and we'll have Tony on again. We're going to be talking about some other stuff down the road. I'll keep that as a surprise. So, everybody, good night. Take care.